Hey everybody, how are you? So I mentioned in my last video that I was going to be looking over a couple of Republican narratives that have become so deeply ingrained in our mental landscape that very few people even bother to question them. Now, the stories that the far right tends to want to tell us all have a pretty similar structure, playing with the same handful of themes and emotions. And the most important of these themes is fear! Oogity boogity ah! Because they understand that being scared makes people stupid. You can't think if you're too busy being terrified. And that's why crime is one of those problems that the far right loves to hate on. If you spend any time watching Fox News, you're going to be told that American cities today are significantly more dangerous than the streets of Gaza or Ukraine. In the Marvel Cinematic Universe, New York City was almost destroyed by the Chitauri aliens. But in the MAGA Cinematic Universe, it is much worse. New York is basically a cross between Woodstock and the Purge, with the semblance of order being maintained by fearless Republican politicians who stand arms locked in front of all the jails and prisons, resisting the hordes of long-haired social justice commandos, desperate to let all those thugs and vermin, or whatever else Trump calls them, free without bail to destroy America. And whenever these brave Republicans aren't keeping the criminals locked up, they're working 2 jobs to make some extra cash to give to the poor police officers that those filthy liberals defunded. Now, I don't know if this is a particularly good story, but it is one that a big chunk of the country believes. Unfortunately, it runs into a little problem with something I like to call reality. Like I said before, far-right narratives are completely dependent on fear. Crime is a real thing, and it can hurt people, and it can be mixed in with racism, which adds another element to the fear. And all that put together makes crime just too tempting an issue to pass up. That's why Republicans have kept talking about it, and talking about it, and talking about it every single year for decades, telling us that we are constantly on the verge of being overrun by criminality, especially violent crime committed by brown people. But then those pesky facts come in and ruin the whole show. Pesky facts like crime dropping precipitously over the last 30 years, with violent crime specifically being roughly half of what it was in 1990. Or that, after a brief spike during the pandemic, violent crime rates have continued to drop, including in that supposed hellhole that is New York, with murder dropping 25% between January of 23 and 24. And another particularly pesky fact is that the rate of crime is actually worse in red states, with 4 out of the 5 highest crime states being bright red and just 1, New Mexico, being a blue/swing state. To top it off, all red states together have a much higher murder rate than blue states for almost 20 years, and it's getting worse, from 9% in 2003 to 43% in 2020. So now I realize I just laid a lot of data on you guys, right? And there are links to all of this stuff in the description. Everything is backed up with research. However, I've noticed that when I go heavy on the data, sometimes I get responses like this. 1. I was in New York City 6 months ago, and when I was walking down the street, I felt unsafe. Or 2. My cousin's mother's chiropractor was carjacked in Brooklyn. Or even 3. I saw a story on Fox News about XYZ, yada yada yada, some horrible crime. So each one of those is a different kind of logical fallacy or mistake in thinking. Let me explain why. So firstly, I feel unsafe. Okay, look, I respect people's personal feelings and experiences and whatnot, right? But let's be clear here. Personal feelings are just that. They're personal. They don't tell you anything about the broader world outside of ourselves. And I've noticed this in myself sometimes, where I made judgments about people in my life based on how I was feeling at the time, rather than actually getting to know who they really were. Likewise, I found myself disliking places because of what was happening inside of me, my own prejudices and hang-ups, and when I revisited them in a different mental state, I felt very differently. What I mean to say is that if you've already been primed to see a certain place in a certain way, that's what you're going to see. And the right-wing media ecosystem fronted by Fox News has spent several decades priming people to see large, diverse cities as these horrible, degenerate, crime-filled catastrophes, regardless of whether the facts actually support that. And by the way, for the rest of the video, I'm going to refer to all the various right-wing news, punditry, information, disinformation outlets in general as right-wing media or RUIM, okay? So we have to be careful to not let our own biases lead us into making judgments when we don't really know the whole picture. Just walking around one part of New York for a day is not going to give you an accurate picture of crime rates even within the city, let alone all over the country. So moving on to the story of the cousin's mother's chiropractor or whatever getting carjacked. We have to be careful not to get distracted by a single event or story. Whenever you shove enough people into a small space, you're gonna get some kind of crime. Cities shove massive amounts of people into sardine can levels of space. So of course there's going to be instances of crime, and then people use that one event to make broad generalizations. RUIM does this on steroids. They can search the whole city or even the whole country to find some story that they can use to terrify people. That's how RUIM creates the narrative that fuels the fear of crime that gets people to watch more RUIM and also vote Republican. However, like I said before, narratives are just stories. And the story doesn't always match the broader reality. All of those big crime stories on right-wing media ignore the reality that violent crime is becoming less and less of a risk in Americans' lives, except mass shootings, obviously, but they don't like to talk about that as much. Moreover, when there is crime, Republicans seem to be worse at actually stopping it. And all of that, of course, is assuming that whatever the big crime story on RUIM is even true. You know, it's so often that I'm sent an article from Fox News, for example, talking about how liberals let some mass murderer out of jail or something similarly egregious. But when I look even a little bit deeper, you know, there's so many details and nuances omitted that the whole story becomes essentially fiction. You know, like the guy was released because he was 93 years old and dying of cancer and got sent to a hospital to die. Or else he got released because some DNA evidence turned up and he was exonerated or something like that. So this example is something that I just made up, but it captures the spirit of how information gets twisted, at least on Fox News, which again acts as the more acceptable face of the disinformation environment on the right. Once you go a little farther into the RUIM ecosystem, however, it gets really crazy. You know, Steve Bannon interviewing Marjorie Taylor Greene on his podcast, for example, will just give you straight up insanity for an hour straight. There isn't even the pretense of evidence or somehow being connected to reality. It's all space lasers and baby blood. And yet people keep getting sucked into these false right-wing narratives that have so deeply damaged our society. And the thing that really drives me crazy, though, is that narrative doesn't have to be used that way. You can build narrative around the truth and use those stories to actually help people, and I'll give you an example of that in a few minutes. Let's talk for a minute about cash bail reform, which is one of those issues that gets closely linked to the conversation around crime in America. John Oliver actually did an excellent video on this issue, which I'm going to link here. He goes into much more detail, but I'm going to cover some of the same ground because it fits my theme so well. As I just mentioned, cash bail reform is one of the issues that typically gets brought out into discussions about police in America, and it's one that Republicans love to demagogue. They love to scare us about rabid, long-hair, left-wing loonies letting all the criminals out of jail, and now the same murderer has been released 10 times and killed 11 people, right? That is how right-wing propaganda works in America today. It's short, it's simple, it's shocking, and it's false. Getting rid of cash bail is not just about letting criminals loose on the streets. It is about preventing money from being the determining factor of whether a person stays locked up pre-trial. You see, propaganda, it's always short on things like evidence or details or facts. Like the fact that over 70% of people in jail in America at any particular time are innocent. And I'm not talking about guys wandering around muttering, "I didn't do nothing," under their breaths. I mean that out of 10 prisoners in American jails, 7 of them have not had their trial yet and are, legally speaking, innocent of all crimes. And being put in jail really, really sucks, which is why we tend to reserve it for criminals who have committed crimes. However, we've got 500,000 of these officially innocent people stuck in jail. And that number has been increasing for decades. Their lives can be absolutely ruined by the time they spend behind bars. Lost jobs, lost homes, even lost families. You know, just think for a minute. What would happen if you were to disappear from your life for a few months or years? Would your house still be there? Your job? Your spouse? You'd lose everything. And with such a serious issue as arrest and detention pre-trial, you'd think that the only two concerns would be whether the person is a flight risk or a potential reoffender, but that's not the case. In many places in America, if you're a poor man charged with holding some weed, you're going to be stuck in jail while your life falls apart. But if you're a rich guy who killed his wife, you can put up bail and go right back to business as usual, at least until the trial. However, many states have changed that system. My state, New Jersey, is apparently a real pioneer in this. Moreover, it was Chris Christie, a Republican, of all people, who signed the bail reform into law as governor. New York and many other states have similar systems, but they're not about willy-nilly releasing all criminals onto the street, not at all. If anything, the judge is given even more discretion to weigh the actual threat this person poses to the community to decide whether they stay in jail or not, rather than the deciding factor being how fat the guy's bank account is. And for nonviolent crimes on a first offense in New York, for example, that means you get released on recognizance. But if they reoffend, they get locked up. RUIM makes it look like criminal recycling, where it's a revolving door for these people to crime as much as they want, but that's just not true. In our system, only Donald Trump can commit crime after crime after crime with impunity. On top of that, just to be clear, there is no evidence that eliminating cash bail increases crime or increases the risk of reoffense. This has been proven statistically time and again, and on this particular issue, I just have to again recommend the video linked in the description from John Oliver on bail reform. He showed the utter hypocrisy of RUIM in general, and a guy named Dermot Shea in particular. Dermot Shea is the commissioner of police in New York, and he was running all over right-wing media saying that bail reform was destroying New York. However, the actual data showed that out of 512 shootings in a 6-month period, only one was committed by someone on bail, giving us a bit less than 0.2%. And Shea himself had to confirm that when he was sat before a legislative hearing under oath. So please remember that, guys. You have no idea how many times I've watched someone say all kinds of nonsense on RUIM, and then say something completely different when there was an official proceeding that required evidence and had people under oath. The biggest example off the top of my head is in regards to the attempted impeachment of Joe/Hunter Biden. The things that the two Jims, Comer and Jordan, were saying compared to what actually came out in the hearings was just unbelievable. These guys were just sitting there lying through their goddamn teeth because they weren't under oath. But that's for another video. And I mentioned a little while ago that I'd give you guys an example of the power of narrative to do some good. John Oliver's video went into this particular story, and it was so powerful, I've decided to retell it after doing a bit of my own research. So in 2010, a 16-year-old boy named Kalief Browder was arrested for committing a robbery. He swore up and down that he was innocent. He was kept locked up on Rikers Island for 3 years, 2 of which were spent in solitary confinement. Now, as a side note, I want to mention that solitary confinement is a form of torture. Even a few days is enough to severely strain the mind of a healthy person. Kalief was 16. His brain wouldn't even be fully developed for another decade, and he was kept in solitary for 2 years. This is just torture. It would be enough to drive anyone insane, let alone a developing child. Completely insane. In all that time, Kalief had no trial, no chance to prove his innocence, and after over 1,000 days, he was just released. That's it. No answers, no excuses, no nothing. They took years from his life, destroyed his psyche, and dumped him out like trash. He took his own life in 2015, age 22. And there are some 500,000 legally innocent people like Kalief sitting in our jails today. That story is an actual, true story. However, the narrative it creates is not just the truth of what happened to a single young man, but rather the broader truth of a phenomenon that is affecting a huge chunk of our society. And this narrative was used to spread bail reform and help other people like Kalief. My point here in this video isn't even to really convince you one way or another about bail reform. It's just to show you how storytelling works in politics and how it can be used to show people reality or to obscure it. Now, while we're on the topic of crime and law and order, we got to talk at least briefly about George Floyd. In Minneapolis, Minnesota in 2020, Floyd was suspected of passing a counterfeit $20 bill in a convenience store. Floyd was a black man, he was unarmed, he was nonviolent, and a group of white police officers held him down with a knee to the neck until he died for what was allegedly $20. I'm not going to link the video here, but you can find it if you have a mind to. Watching that man die, slowly begging for air, begging for his mother, it is haunting. And also got a lot of people, some 20 million, to stand up and march in the streets. This was the first time, in my lifetime at least, that I really saw America coming face to face with the way that our police use violence against us, and especially those of us who aren't white. So obviously what happened next is that everyone got together to reasonably discuss police reform and public safety. Just kidding. Of course it devolved into a culture war shit show, centering around two themes. The first of these themes was defund the police. Before we go further, I want to really briefly go over what defund the police was actually all about. We spend a lot of money on police in this country, over $100 billion a year. And a good chunk of this money goes to things like equipping local police officers with hand-me-down armored personnel carriers and machine guns from the military and other ridiculously unnecessary toys. We're spending all of this money sending heavily armed men to lock people up to the point where we have the highest rate of incarceration of any OECD nation. That's Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. You'd think that if locking more people up was a solution to crime, that we'd have the best crime rates, but we don't. Crime rates have been going down overall, but they're still not as low as nations in Europe that spend much less money having their police use force to go after people. Maybe some of the money we spend on the violent arms of law enforcement can be used to hire social workers and substance abuse counselors who could get to the root causes of some of these social issues. In fact, there are areas, some cities, where 90% or more of calls to police are for nonviolent situations where maybe some other arm of the law or government might be better suited to handling the situation. Maybe a hammer isn't the best solution to 100% of problems. And all of this is perfectly reasonable to almost anybody. The fact is that we are asking cops to handle situations that they were never trained or prepared for, like dealing with people in a mental health crisis or drug addiction, and the only tool they really have is a gun. Of course it's going to lead to extra violence. And nobody was saying that the solution was just to get rid of all police. Maybe you can find, some left-wing activist on Twitter saying that we don't need any laws or police at all, and just let everybody do whatever they want, and peace and love and all that. But there wasn't a single national-level Democratic politician who was saying anything like that. However, right-wing propaganda works in recognizable and predictable ways. And it got to work on this issue the same as it does for many others. The first step was to dumb everything down to the lowest possible level. And as a brief side note, I often wonder how many people would watch Fox News if they realized the degree to which the host there held them in absolute contempt. Like, I saw this in what came out during the Dominion versus Fox defamation trials. For those who don't recall, when Fox News helped Trump accuse Dominion voting systems of stealing the 2020 election, Fox got sued for $750 million. And what came out in those court proceedings was the degree to which the Fox people knew they were lying, and the degree to which they held their viewers in absolute contempt. They believed that their viewers are not only complete brain-dead morons, but also whiny little children who would throw a fit if they were ever told the truth rather than what they wanted to hear. And that is crazy to me. I mean, I'm talking to an audience right now, though admittedly a much smaller one than Fox News. And believe me, I don't think you're a bunch of idiots. I mean, I don't know how I could do this if all the while I was holding this totally cynical idea that, they're all morons, I can feed them whatever I want. It's nuts. I have the other assumption. I assume my viewers are going to be sharp as a tack, so I try to double check all my sources and limit my mistakes as much as I can. But not the Fox people. They have a different approach. Like I said, their step one is dumbing everything down, and that's exactly what they did with Defund the Police. They remove all the nuance, all the details, and instead of maybe funds can be partially reallocated in order to address causes of crime and social dysfunction that aren't best resolved with violence, and that gets repackaged as, no cops, no law, black dude breaks in your house, Which brings us to the second and third steps in right-wing propagandizing. Step 2 is to add fear, and Step 3 is to add an enemy group. They do this to every issue. Dumb it down, jack up the fear, point it at someone you're already supposed to hate, and it works like goddamn clockwork. A great example is what happened with the container ship that crashed into the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore. Step 1. Dumb it down by removing any conversation about infrastructure or maritime regulation and law or any of the many other complex issues in this tragedy. Step 2. Spread as much panic as possible. Say it was an attack by terrorists. Say that all infrastructure will collapse tomorrow. And step 3, and this already started in step 2 by saying it was terrorists who brought the bridge down, you have to add an enemy, right? Then, of course, along with terrorists, right-wing media was insisting that DEI caused the bridge to collapse. Not too many details on exactly how DEI caused the bridge to collapse, of course, but they don't need details. Leave aside the fact that the bridge was built in 1972 before DEI was a thing. That's, again, just more details. And then they say that President Biden made the bridge collapse. How? Was it when he signed into law the largest upgrade to American infrastructure in my lifetime? Or maybe he somehow made the Republicans vote against his expanded Build Back Better plan, which would have added even more needed improvements to our aging infrastructure. Of course, none of it makes sense if you look in a little deeper, and it's not supposed to. The purpose of propaganda is so that you don't think deeper and ask questions. That's why it always works on emotions and works on the same narrative pattern. Dumb it down, add fear, point it at someone you already hate. Sorry for the detour there, guys. That bridge collapse story was just such a perfect example of the right-wing media propaganda machine at work that I had to point it out. So, along with defund the police, there was another focus for the right-wing kind of propaganda culture war machine, and that was the national anthem. Some of you might remember well how in the wake of George Floyd's murder, football player Colin Kaepernick took a knee during the national anthem, right? A slight side note I quite often mention in my videos or use as a source something I saw on the Midas Touch News Network, and I'm a huge fan of what they're trying to do. As it happens, Ben Meiselas, the founder of Midas, was Kaepernick's lawyer and helped him out with a lot of this, so go Midas Mighty. Anyway, if the reaction of Fox News was anything to go by, Kaepernick must have had a freaking nuclear bomb strapped to his knee or something. I mean, the moment his skin touched the grass, these people were just losing their goddamn minds. The level of cataclysmic panic at Fox News was so bad, anchors were all but shitting themselves on live TV. Sean Hannity's aides and interns had to wear splash-proof raincoats because the guy was just bursting blood vessels every other second, and if they dodged that, they'd get hit with the waves of spittle coming from Maria Bartiromo. Now, Colin Kaepernick's taking the knee as a sign of protest was apparently the greatest insult in the history of America. It was far worse than 9/11, Pearl Harbor, and the Civil War combined. He was a traitor, a pedophile, a communist. He hated America and God and cops and football and apple pie and everything good in the world. To say that the right wing utterly lost its mind over this is an understatement to end all understatements. And yet, this whole massive, performative spectacle was absolute bullshit from the start. These people never cared about the anthem or cops or America or any of that. Let me explain what I mean. Right now, Donald Trump is the head of the Republican Party. He is their lord and master to the point where he just decreed his own daughter-in-law to be head of the RNC. At his rallies, the American national anthem is no longer the song of the day. Instead, it's a song called, ironically, And Justice for All. That song was sung by, as Trump would say, a very special choir. The requirement for membership in this musical group is having participated in and being convicted of the attempted violent overthrow of our government on January 6th. The people singing this song, who Trump every day calls heroes and hostages, are the people who physically broke into the Capitol for him. These are the people who were shouting to hang Mike Pence and kill Nancy Pelosi in order to stop the certification of a legitimate election. And they were doing it because Trump wanted them to do it. Those same people injured 140 police officers, physically assaulting them with fists and flagpoles and bear spray and tasers, and this physical assault eventually led to the deaths of 5 of those officers later on. Donald Trump is literally opening his rallies with the cop killer choir, and they are proud of this. Trump even had his first rally of his re-election campaign in Waco, Texas, the site of the most famous standoff between the government and an armed anti-government group since the Civil War, and the birthplace of many white nationalist and anti-government conspiracies. While Trump promised revenge and retribution in Waco, his messaging minion, Steve Bannon, called the people at the rally Trump Davidians to link them to the Branch Davidians. And for those of you wondering, the Branch Davidians was the name of that anti-government cult that got into a shootout with the feds because the ATF tried to prevent them from stockpiling weaponry. And that same narrative, by the way, fuels the heavily armed pro-Trump and anti-government militias that are currently recognized by the FBI as the #1 terrorist threat in the United States. And despite all of that, there is not one word, not one solitary iota of concern from Fox News. These people who supposedly love police and are all for law and order and love America and the national anthem are totally and absolutely hunky-dory with their leader, replacing the national anthem entirely by doing a sing-along with the cop killer choir. Literally, these people are murderers of police, and Trump is singing with them. He's calling them heroes and political dissidents. Imagine for a moment if Biden replaced the national anthem with a song he recorded with a bunch of Al-Qaeda terrorists currently in jail for killing U.S. service members or law enforcement. It would be the biggest news story of all time. It would be considered a national catastrophe. And yet Trump does the same thing literally every goddamn day. And it's not even news. It's barely covered. Admittedly, though, the right has become just masterful at pulling off these 180s of raw bullshit where they completely reverse their stance on something but still try to claim credit for it. They still claim to be the party of patriotism despite getting rid of the national anthem and just in general constantly calling America a failing nation and actively trying to dismantle our government. They still claim to be the party of police despite calling cop killers heroes. And this hypocrisy extends, because of course it does, to the issue of defunding police. While no national-level Democrats have done anything to defund police, Republicans have done so repeatedly. Biden authorized $350 billion to keep local police and law enforcement employed during COVID, and another $650 million for the COPS, or Community-Oriented Policing Services Program, which Republicans voted against. Likewise, Speaker Mike Johnson is urging defunding by up to 10% for various government agencies, but very specifically law enforcement agencies like the FBI. Now, the narrative Johnson is pushing is that the FBI doesn't deserve to be funded because it has a systemic bias against Republicans and is acting as a political enforcement arm of the Democratic Party. This is a lie. It's not just a lie, but it's an idiotic lie. Johnson cannot possibly believe in good faith that the FBI is biased against Republicans. Firstly, let's take a look at the FBI. Its current head is a guy named Christopher Wray. Christopher Wray is a Republican. The director before him was James Comey, a Republican. Before him, it was Robert Mueller of the Mueller Report fame, who is again a Republican. In fact, every director the FBI has ever had since it was founded under J. Edgar Hoover has been a Republican. For just about a century, this institution has been entirely and solely controlled by Republicans. To think that it's some arm of the left is just completely ignoring reality. Moreover, this is the same FBI that's going to put Hunter Biden and Senator Bob Menendez before the courts where they could face jail time, and probably before Trump. The reason the FBI is investigating Trump is because there is overwhelming evidence that he committed overwhelming crimes. That's it. Moreover, because it is a federal organization with a lot of oversight and standardization and rules, procedures, and regulations, the FBI tends to be a lot more professional about its work than local police departments do. There's a lot fewer random killings of black people, for example, at least in more recent times. The work that FBI, DOJ, and even the IRS do are all incredibly important for maintaining law and order. They are amazingly good at stopping terrorist attacks, for example, which is why no foreign terrorist has really managed to land a hit on the U.S. since 9/11. In fact, our guys are so good, they warned the Russians about the attack they had a few weeks ago, but Putin chose to ignore them for various reasons, which are for another video. The point is that the FBI does a lot to keep us safe. However, MAGA Republicans don't actually care about keeping us safe. That was all nonsense, and it always was. The purpose of law enforcement, as the far right sees it today, isn't actually to keep the peace, but rather to keep certain undesirables out of sight. So long as they stick to killing black and brown people and kicking homeless people out of the way, that's fine. But once the law goes after their precious spray-tanned God King, then obviously the law has to go. Poor Trumpikins is special. He can't be expected to actually go to jail just because he did a bunch of crimes. That's for poor people. But just beyond protecting Trump himself, Johnson and the Republican leadership also want to protect their foot soldiers. The fact is that white nationalist domestic terrorism has, for several years already, been assessed as the #1 terrorism threat in the United States, and they've all been briefed on it again and again and again and again. However, Trump and the Republicans don't give a damn about that. They encourage these people, just as Trump does at all his rallies, talking about poisoned blood and retribution, just like he did on January 6th when Kevin McCarthy called Trump to call off the rioters, and Trump said, "They're not here for me." He knew they weren't going to hurt him because they were his supporters. It's as simple as that. So long as these right-wing terrorists attack the people Trump doesn't like, including his political opponents or the families of anyone trying to prosecute him, he doesn't mind letting the Republican Party gut the FBI and set these people loose on our streets. In fact, if you want more information on just how insane the level of violence is and just how deeply accepted it has become within the Republican Party, I recommend you watch a documentary that I've also got linked in the description. It's called Against All Enemies. It's made by Ken Harbaugh. He's a veteran, and he's also a Midas Touch guy. And he goes into all of this far-right, militia, Civil War, Looney Tunes type of stuff, especially with an eye for how those groups target and recruit military veterans. Watch it. It's really interesting stuff. So to sum everything up, Republicans are all about getting you scared and lying to you that they care about your safety, about our country, about law and order, etc. But if you look at the facts, there's absolutely no reason why we should be allowing them any ground on this issue. MAGA Republican policies not only don't give a damn about law and order or your personal safety, the MAGA Republican Party is an active sponsor of terrorist organizations that is perfectly comfortable using violence to achieve its political ends, and using performative hypocrisy to brainwash people into going along with it. Don't be fooled, people. If you really want safe streets free of both crime and heavily armed fascist militias, vote blue. Thanks for watching that, guys. I really appreciate it. If you liked that video, then please like the video. And also subscribe. That would be really, really helpful. And most of all, please leave a comment if you can, because firstly, it really helps algorithmically, and also I'm pretty new at this, and I could use the feedback. So if you could do that and also share these videos with your relatives and friends, that would be really nice. Till next time, guys. Bye-bye.